Wow, get ready for Andrew Lacy, the co-founder and CEO of Prenuvo, the latest, greatest testing that we can begin to do to understand better what's going on in our bodies. I tried it. I learned a lot. So let's roll and talk to Andrew Lacy, the founder CEO of Prenuvo. Andrew, how are you today, Andrew?
I'm awesome, thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, good to see you again. Well, we have a lot to cover, but we have a little tradition at Livelong in our podcast, and we have some kind of lighter questions to ask you before we dig deep into all the serious stuff.
Sure.
So you ready for those? It's called the Healthy
Absolutely.
Habits Survey. Good. What'd you eat for breakfast today, Andrew?
I had absolutely nothing,
Oh,
unfortunately. Well, unfortunately, I don't usually eat breakfast, to be honest.
okay. Well, that brings me to the next question then. How did you sleep last night, and how many hours did you sleep at night?
I started doing a sort of wet sauna in the evening and then jumping straight into bed, and I find it awesome. It gives me 8 hours sleep almost every day.
Hey, help me out. You called it a wet sauna. That's not a steam room.
A
That's
steam, exactly, a steam room.
okay,
Yeah,
cool.
that's my Aussie vernacular.
So you do that in the evening. I bet that's great for your sleep.
Yeah, it's great. And then you get into a cold bed and you just like zonk out straight away.
Cold bed, like what do you mean? Ice or something? No, no ice.
Like, in a cold room,
Ah,
not too warm. And that, I think, temperature differential just puts me straight to sleep.
well, I'm going to try everything you recommend here, Andrew, and I'll get back to you. Do you take any supplements? You don't look like you need supplements. You look so healthy.
I don't. I take vitamin D from time to time. I'm very good at buying supplements. I'm not very good at actually taking them.
That's that's what they want you to do. No, they want you to chew a lot of them and buy more. Uh, yeah, I think that whole supplement thing. We had a guest last week, and he said if it's not regulated, I don't take it. And I thought, wow. Which brings me to you in a minute about whether you're regulated. But let's start with, uh,
We're gonna go right there.
yeah,
How regular I
yeah.
am.
Do you have a wearable? Do you have a ring or a Apple Watch or any of that stuff?
No, no, I don't. I would say like my biggest health hack is that aside from interviews, more or less spend my entire day on a walking treadmill desk. So, I guess like I'm sort of walking on my wearable, which gives me sort of feedback on how much exercise I'm doing every day.
Well, that answers my last question. Do you get any exercise? Sounds like you do all the time. Well, let's get started. I'll just share really quickly. I did years ago a full body scan in New York at that company that was kind of Web 1.10 version of what you're doing. Scared the hell out of me. I felt like I was in a mechanical device from the 50s or something, and full of people in a hospital in the upper east side of New York, and it was hot and cold and horrible. And then I did yours a couple years ago. Tell us what the Prenuvo whole body MRI is, and what's the science and technology behind it. And then maybe we can, second part of that question is, how do you respond to my experience that I laid out?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a lot to unpack, but
Yep.
just starting with what the scan is. So this is we operate 17 clinics around the US now. They're our own clinics. So we're the only provider who just does whole body MRI. And and the reason for that, the reason we have our own clinics is that we have built our own custom research grade MRI machines. So
When
the
you say
technology,
recess grade, what is that, Andrew? What does that
uh,
mean?
re- research grade. So
Research. Okay,
they're
gotcha.
very powerful, and they're able to image patients about 3 to 4 times faster than a regular MRI.
Ah.
And really, that's what enabled the scan because MRIs have been around for 20 or 30 years. They're widely understood by everyone to be really the most powerful imaging modality for imaging the soft tissue. And the soft tissue being the organs of our body, where obviously we get cancer and we have disease. And the challenge has always been that MRI technology is very slow. So by speeding this up while still taking clinical diagnostic quality images, we're able to now cover the entire body in under 1 hour, and that really sort of enabled the scan.
So not the results, but the actual time you spend in that little
In the
scary
machine. Yeah.
rocket ship.
Yeah, in fact, the only folks that really were getting whole body MRIs before Prenuvo were people with genetic cancer predisposition syndrome. And they would go to large academic institutions, and it would be a 3 to 4 hour procedure. And oftentimes, particularly for younger people, they had to get general anesthetic just because lying in one of the machines for 3 or 4 hours is sort of beyond the abilities of most people to tolerate it.
And as I recall,
100 hours is a lot easier and a lot, a
oh
lot less
yeah,
difficult.
I found it really. I mean, I got nervous at the end. It's like, let me out of here, but I stuck it out for the last couple minutes. So I get out of it. You're all very nice. You took care of me. It was a great experience. And then you get your results, as I recall, in a week or two. Do I have that right, or is it quicker than that?
It's a bit faster now. Now it's about 3 or 4 days.
Gotcha. And what happens when you get the results before you give it to me? Um, do you Who looks at it? Who are these doctors, nurses, practitioners? Do you look at all of them? I doubt if you do, right?
Yeah, well, this is the other thing that really differentiates us is we have a team of now 80 radiologists that have been trained on whole body radiology. Many of them have fellowships and specialties from some of the leading academic institutions in the US, and they work individually and collectively to make the reading that we do as accurate as possible. So there's typically one radiologist that's assigned to every reading. So there's a generalist that looks at every single organ in the body, and a lot of what they see they're able to characterize because there's sort of a small set of conditions that are quite common.
Right.
And if they see anything that's very unusual, they then sort of like call in the brain trust of specialists that really have spent their entire careers looking at a certain organ in the body. And collectively, they're able to then characterize things that can be quite rare. I mean, we've found conditions that there are only 2 or 3 published cases, in the academic literature. The reading is I guess, translated into a report for the patient and a report for their physician. And we send each to, one to the patient, one to the physician. In the patient, those results show up in an app where they can navigate through the different organs of their body and view their images. And for a patient, it's a more traditional report, but just very comprehensive, going through every organ in the body.
And tell me this, how many false positives do you get? Like, do you have a percentage where, because it's kind of scary if you were to either miss something or conclude there's something wrong when it isn't. And is it consistent with the standards of the profession, or?
Yeah, well, you talk about 2 things there, really, false negatives and false positives.
Yeah.
And on the false negative side, again, MRI is just widely understood to be, a very, very sensitive technology. And in our clinical practice, we don't have a lot of cases, where we've missed anything that we're aware of. And in fact, in the sort of, if you sort of zoom out and say, well, what's the alternative? It's sort of an annual physical where you go in and see a patient and, they push and prod on your body and then say you're healthy or not. I mean, there's no greater test in the world in producing false negatives because a lot of people are given an all clear and they're actually, oftentimes can be quite serious underlying medical conditions. On the false positive side, here, it's important to really understand what we're doing with MRI, which is we're looking inside the body, and if we see a lesion, we are risk classifying it.
You're doing what? Risk classifying?
Yeah, we're doing a risk classification. So we see a lesion, we are either, we classify it on a 5-point scale, where 1 and 2 is benign. You don't need to really do anything about this. 4 and 5 are increasing degrees of concern that this is most likely to be a malignancy, and 3 is sort of indeterminate.
Gotcha.
And of course, like if we find something that's 4 or 5 and someone gets, maybe an additional imaging test and it turns out to be all clear, that's a great outcome because we saw something that, had characteristics of malignancy and it wasn't. The real effort of the company is behind reducing the number of category 3 lesions that we find, the indeterminate ones, where you're doing tests and the outcomes of those tests are very uncertain.
Or what? It would say that again, Andrew. I missed it.
The outcome of those tests are very uncertain. We don't know.
Yeah.
And again, I come back to the hardware that we use and the software acquisition protocols that we follow and the training of the radiologists. All of this is designed to really minimize that category 3. And so far, the internal clinical studies we've done are pretty promising. I mean, our positive biopsy rate, so these are lesions that we identify that get biopsied and are shown to be cancer, is 56%, which is higher than a lot of standard of care imaging.
So wait a second, 56% of your identification of a lesion, which then goes to a biopsy,
Biopsy,
come back as
positive for
actual,
cancer. Yeah,
yeah.
positive for malignancy.
That must be hard as a company. Like, what do you do? You call someone up and say they have cancer. How do you handle that? I mean, I guess it's what we're all used to, but testing is nerve-wracking and full of tension. And in fact, I think the New Yorker article that was pretty hard on you about a year ago said that anxiety might be worse than what you get from the results of the test. I'm not sure that's true, but
Yeah, look, I think everyone has a little bit of anxiety. I'd be lying. I'm the CEO of the company, and every time I go and get a scan myself once a year,
yeah,
there's a little bit of me that's a bit nervous about what they might find. And I think some part of that is just because we only have one body,
yeah,
and we can't switch it out if something's going wrong with it. Um, but a big part of that for me is the reactive healthcare system that we have to work inside every day. And in that system, every single medical condition that you could be diagnosed with is automatically scary and life-changing because we only ever catch things late.
yeah,
And what we find when we find cancer is that more often than not, we are catching it at a stage 1 or stage 2. So still localized to the organ of origin and perhaps the surrounding lymph nodes.
So you're
And
saving lives, Andrew.
exactly.
Is
And a
that how
lot
you
of
think
these,
about your vision or your mission?
100%. So, and a lot of these cancers, pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer, we will send them to specialists in their fields to be treated. And a lot of times those specialists say, hey, you have no idea how rare it is to see a stage 1 pancreatic cancer that I can
Yeah,
actually operate on.
yeah.
So it really is turning back the clock on diagnosing not just cancer, but also chronic disease.
Tell me this. When you put me under, I have heart disease. I have 3 stents. You didn't look at my heart, right? Hearts is not an organ you deal with.
We didn't. We can look at the gross size of your heart, and there are some conditions that can affect just how big the heart looks visually. We can understand how the heart is pumping blood by looking to see if there's any fluid in your lungs or your lower extremities, and we can get something of a sense of your cardiovascular disease profile by actually looking at your brain, because you have very little tiny capillaries there, and they're some of the first blood vessels that will get blocked,
Mhm.
by
If your heart's not operating properly.
correct. Yeah. So that's kind of the current state of the art of what we're doing at Prenuvo. Although next year we're looking to introduce a dedicated cardiac sequence to really
It
get
would
us
seem
better.
like you should because I get all those tests because I have the stents. I do it regularly, and it'd be nice if it was all bundled into one set of services instead of going here, there, and everywhere. Let me ask another one. My wife went through it, and she had been diagnosed, or what is it? Not diagnosed, but they discovered what is it called? An aneurysm,
Hmm.
very small, 2.5 milligrams. Is that correct? Do I have it?
Millimeters.
Millimeters. And we all freaked out,
Hmm.
not using Prenuvo. And she's in Europe, so she did it in Paris, and they're really good at this stuff. And then she came to the US, she came to our conference. She heard you, and she took the test, and you guys found nothing. And then she called up some phone number, and you guys drilled down and discovered it. What would happen that the initial testing would have missed that? It made her feel like either they screwed up in Paris or you guys screwed up. And I guess this brings up the larger question of, my NYU doctor says, you're over testing, Brad. You do everything. You got to stop doing all this stuff. Um, what would happen there that might have occurred? Because the
Yeah.
family's going through a lot of. It was exactly like that New York article which she went through.
Hmm.
The anxiety, and it wasn't from you guys; it was from the test in Paris. just a couple months before. But help us understand that. So people that do this can have really clear expectations. I think there's a lot of like, oh, my scan came out great. I'm fine. I used to get my test for my heart, and I'd go out and drink and smoke and do all the bad things once I got clearance, and that was probably not a good thing to be doing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me maybe try and answer the question as best I can without obviously speaking to her particular case. Um, what we're learning as we look into a lot of brains, I suppose, is that obviously the sort of plumbing that we all have is, can be somewhat unique. There are sort of like there's a standard plumbing, and then there's like congenital sort of anomalies which really have no impact on your life. But someone's plumbing might just look a little bit different. And even when we started imaging a lot of patients, we were starting to diagnose a lot more aneurysms than we expected.
You were
And
finding more than
yeah,
you.
but they were very small, so they're in this sort of 2 to 2.5 millimeter range. And at that range, it's hard to be completely declarative about whether this is an aneurysm or this is just a sort of a slightly different kink in the sort of plumbing of the brain. There's not a lot that you can action with a 2 millimeter aneurysm anyhow, other than sort of watch and see. And particularly for someone that doesn't have any real risk factors. So if your wife, wasn't a smoker or didn't have high blood pressure,
Don't worry about it.
or just check it again in the next year or two. Aneurysms can be, they're like little balloons. And if anyone's blown up a balloon, you'll recall that it's like really hard to get started. And then it sort of gets easier the bigger the balloon becomes. So, 2 millimeters is very, very, very small. And typically what we recommend would just be watchful waiting for aneurysms of that size in someone that has no risk factors. And
I love
I'm
that.
sure her
I love
physician
that.
said the same thing.
Yeah.
But of course, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking for the patient.
I love the watchful waiting because all of this stuff, which in my journey, we created a media company starting with my own personal journey to prevent the Grim Reaper from showing up at my door. And everything is about being on top of your body in better ways than we may have done in the past. And I think we hear over and over, it's healthcare, not sick care. This whole preventative thing. But let me go back to my experience. So I had it done. My doctor was like, "Oh, geez, stop it." I think he scanned it, looked at it. But I felt like this with everything. I did the biomarker stuff. I did all the stuff that's going on, that I was kind of left hanging. And I guess what I worry about, I get the sick care problem, the reactive nature of what I was getting before. My heart's bad. They finally find out in 24 hours I'm under the knife at NYU in New York. That seems kind of bad, and I should have known. It's my responsibility. But a lot of this stuff you guys are all doing,
Yeah.
I should say you men and women, because I've been to all kinds of different experiences. It's DIY a little bit. Like, okay, I volunteered. My doctor didn't tell me to go. So it starts out by me being DIY. I'm going and doing this on my own. But then I felt in all cases, I was left a little hanging. There's some
Yeah.
email. It was kind of like getting a customer service survey. I think I got that from you guys before anything. Or an Uber experience or ordering food. Is that where the world's going and we just have to accept this kind of transactional health experience where we're responsible? Or do all of you need to invest more on the follow-up? And so that we kind of know what to do with this. And maybe I was ignoring things you were sending me. I could be responsible, but I think, when I do something with my doctor, boy, he's all over me. Like follow up, follow up, follow up.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit of everything. So I would say if for patients where we find what we call significant results, so these are not necessarily just life-threatening things. It might be severe fatty liver, or it might be a severe issue in the spine, or it might be something that a patient could misunderstand. So we have things that you know they're benign tumors, but if a patient goes and Googles it, the only word they see is the word tumor. And we proactively reach out to the patient that is a medical practitioner here and or their physician, and really take the time to understand, those medical results, contextualize it for the patient, and understand what to do next. So there is a sort
So
of bifurcation.
you put us on tiers of like severity of
Correct.
the
Yeah.
results,
So,
and then we're
exactly.
elevated to the full. The
Exactly. So,
gotcha.
so yeah, just so that your listeners understand. So if there's something serious, there's a certain protocol that we follow. If if a patient just has a typical wear and tear, a little bit of a slip disc here, or a mild fatty liver there, oftentimes we just release a report directly to the patient and their physician. Of course, a lot of patients don't have primary care providers. That's one problem.
Really?
That as a health system, we need to figure out how to solve. There are a lot of primary care providers that are not familiar with these tests, but every time, as we grow and test more patients, there are a lot more physicians that have seen one or two of our tests and sort of understand it a little bit better. So that problem's slowly being solved. And there are a lot of specialist institutions that really don't, we never really had connection with ourselves personally, but who have subsequently, as they've worked on cases, these life-saving cases, these early cancers, pancreatic, ovarian, and so on, have started to reach out to us and say, hey, if you see any more of these, here's a way that you can fast track them inside my institution.
That's
And then
great news.
that becomes something that we can then provide to patients so that they can get access to really top quality care, and obviously get fast access to treatment, so that people spend less time worrying about what to do next.
The other thing, I live in Europe not half the time, and there I just walk in, pay what's called true costs. They don't care about a referral or anything, and they test you. They're kind of cynical too, but they do it. They're kind of asking us, "Why are you doing this?" But whereas here, because we have an insurance-based system, there they don't, right? If you're not a resident of France, for example, you pay true costs, and true costs are a nickel on the dollar compared to here, so it's cheap as heck. But you are
Yeah.
paying for the service. If you're a resident of France, a citizen, you don't pay anything. So you can go around and do anything you want within reason, right? Here, the referral, the insurance, there's all of these barriers, and
Yeah.
then the cram down from the insurance. I mean, it's so corrupt. It's really horrible. How do you guys? I mean, isn't that the biggest problem, that the established medical community, like my doctor, who's a great doctor, kind of saying, don't do that stuff? I mean, they're just unfamiliar with this institutionally, culturally, right? And it seems the best of all worlds is when my doctor willingly, I mean, he'll look at it. I don't want to say that, but it just doesn't fit into their protocol or their methods. How do we begin to crack that? Do we have to build a complete alternative system, or can we get NYU and all the rest of these characters to buy into what you're doing? Because, by the way, despite my criticisms and bringing up things that happen, I think what you're doing is fantastic. I mean, where
Yeah.
we can take control of our own health care and get out of this reactive system. But what's the solution here, Andrew? I mean, I assume
Right.
this isn't insured, right?
It's not insured,
Well,
and
that's bullshit.
it's the $1 million question. Are we do not have a good history in the US, but to be honest, most any country, including I lived in France as well, so I sort of have some idea of the system there. There is not a health system in the world that has figured out more than 3 or 4 different sort of like preventative health tests, and most of those have come 20, 30, or 40 years after those tests were clinically proven. So the time from like discovery of an interesting test that can save lives to it being adopted as part of standard of care is really, really, really long. And you would like to think it was a purely scientific process, but to be perfectly honest, things like mammogram, I mean, there's a whole host of characters that played a role in actually getting those covered that weren't doctors or scientists. Nancy Reagan in the US. I mean, she was such a big proponent of mammogram and had her own issues, that she really propelled and sort of raised awareness of the fact that we don't have tests for this really horrible disease. And so, we as a company, we work hard to collect evidence, and follow up patients a year after they come in, just really to understand what did we find, what did we miss, if anything. What came of things that we diagnosed, where we asked patients to do additional testing or treatment. And all of this is in basically the objective is to advance our understanding of how accurate these tests are and try and get a sense of like what might it look like if they were implemented at the scale of a population. And that will take realistically years for us to do.
Yeah.
And in fact, the way that the yardstick that people sort of would like to see these tests proved against is a reduction in all causes mortality, which is almost hard to imagine as less than a 30-year clinical study. So the question therefore becomes, if you're a consumer, what do you do in the meantime?
Yeah.
Our belief is that these tests are not, there's no harmful radiation, there's no harmful contrast. Yes, there's, you're going to learn things about your health that, maybe the health system hasn't got you excited to learn about before, but most of what you learn is typically early and can be addressed with lifestyle modification or, outpatient procedures. You're not quitting your job and like trying to like survive a disease that would be sort of the typical situation if it was diagnosed in the health system. And
So we have a ways to go, Andrew, before we
yeah,
fix the old broken system. But are you regulated?
yeah. I mean, we're regulated by the FDA, the machines that
Oh,
we
you
use,
are.
and we are regulated by the medical boards, the
Yep.
radiology that we do. Yeah.
Because there's a lot of stuff going on out there that's not regulated, which we're trying in our newsletters and podcasts to help people understand. That there's the old established world that needs to be reformed, but there's this new world emerging that's full of a lot of chuckleheads and scary things that we're trying to expose as well.
Yeah,
I
no,
got to tell.
and to be clear, we've been doing this for 15 years. There's only been one time we ever got sort of like brought before a medical board in all the states that we operate in, and the crux of the complaint was that a patient, we had found pancreatic cancer early stage in a patient, and their doctor refused to do anything about it.
Wow.
And so we went to the board and said, "Well, I'm pretty sure this is the Hippocratic Oath. Like the doctor is supposed to do something about it," and that
Yeah.
was like quickly dismissed.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of unfortunate people are ignoring that code. Uh, we're running out of time here, Andrew, but let me ask you a quick question. If big picture, this is way up, 60,000 feet. What is an overlooked aspect of aging that you think will become a kind of key focus in the coming years? I'm taking you out of the realm of your product and what you do, and we really drilled down, I think, well here. But any thoughts on that? Because I'm at a conference tomorrow with 40-year-olds. It's money and health. It's called, and they want to know what to do about longevity. What's the things out in the future that's going to begin to
Oh.
change? An overlooked aspect of aging that's going to really become front and center. Do you think?
Well, look, this is not sexy, and this is something that we see, but I think it's the one thing I worry the most about that no one is talking about, which is MSK degeneration. And
Tell us what the acronym is for our audience.
so musculoskeletal degeneration, basically, spinal degeneration.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is, as we grew across the US, we had some young people come in their 20s, and we would look at their spines, and I would show the radiologist, say, "Hey, how old do you think this person is?" And they would say, "I think this person's in their 40s." So all of these, the great I guess, biological experiment that's been happening the last 20, 30 years is we evolved from a sort of like a humanoids that largely were active during the day doing things to all sitting down and now looking at phones where our necks are sort of bent
Yeah.
over in a at an angle that they're not designed to be held. And we are seeing tremendous impact of this in younger people that may today be asymptomatic, but you have to ask the question, how many of them are going to be symptomatic in their late 40s, early 50s? And the visual I get when I think about this is, when you get off a plane and you see those like half dozen wheelchairs waiting for people to like get
Yeah.
off the plane. I reckon if we don't do something about this in 20, 30 years, that line of wheelchairs is going to go out the jet bridge.
Yeah.
Because when you have an accelerated degeneration in the spine and pain, you lose mobility. And when you lose mobility, you don't live that long after that.
Yeah.
So that for me is the big one that people just don't realize. And that's why I'm doing my treadmill desk every day
Yeah.
because I've seen it and I don't want to end up that way.
Yeah. Now, yeah, I think there's so many areas that people are talking about, but I think you really nailed that one. I couldn't, and we've done it to ourselves, I think is what you're saying. And well,
Yeah,
that's great. And those are the kind of things that you do detect in your test, right?
correct.
So
Yeah, we're
so
very good at
that probably makes sense for younger people to take advantage of this. I'll
yeah,
tell everybody tomorrow.
to have a baseline. Let's see what's happening with those discs there,
Yeah.
and let's look at your spinal cord. Everyone has a unique spinal cord. Some have big ones with a lot of space, and some have very tight, compact ones. And
Yeah.
if you have early degeneration and you have a congenitally narrow spinal canal, your future does not look great if you don't address those problems.
I really believe that, and it did help me in a lot of different ways I didn't get into. But thank you so much for being here, and stay in touch with us, Andrew.
Thanks for having me. See you next
Take care.
year.